Hello, everybody. Hello to my high school crew. Welcome to another day of real estate school. This is day 7, and we had a very exciting thing happen today, or yesterday was day 1 of the commission boot camp. And day 2 of the commission boot camp, we already have up on our Facebook page. We're going to post that to YouTube. I strongly suggest checking that out. Amy and Zach are teaching you guys how to get paid right now. And people were hopping on the phones yesterday. And you know how many phone calls it took for the first person to find a potential deal? James, how many phone calls do you think it took?
200?
200. Seven.
Oh.
Seven phone calls to find the first potential deal. And this is how it happened. My mom is working on getting licensed. And she was one of, I think, 10, 12 agents that were, or agents in training, finders that were looking to find and identify people who needed to buy and sell real estate. And my mom was using the Texas script that we were talking about. And it turns out somebody does want to leave the state of California to go to Texas. And so that's something that we're already working on. So we were talking about the Texas script. We were talking about the California script. What does that look like? So you knock on a door, you dial a phone or whatnot, and you say, are you or anyone that you know planning on leaving the state of California this year? And then if they say yes, then you can say, well, if you'd like, I'm a student right now. I'm an agent in training working at a local real estate school. I could provide you a free market analysis, and then that way, or I could connect you with somebody, a professional, that could give you a free market analysis, and then that way you know what your home is worth. And then that way, if you decide that you want to leave, you can do that. Now, if they say no, I'm not planning on leaving, the answer is still the same. Well, if you'd like, I could get your market analysis together, connect you with a professional that can give you your home value, and that way you know how much your home is worth, even though you're not going anywhere. The houses are selling like hotcakes right now. A lot of real estate is moving, and you just figured a lot of people might want to know what their home is worth. And then that way, when you contact us, I could walk you through a little bit of things, teach you some stuff, and then we can send out that market analysis with a licensed professional, set up an appointment, and then whether or not they are moving, this is one of the things I tell people, whether you are moving or not, I just want you to have the best decision that, whether or not you sell, I just want you to have all of the information that you need so that you can make the best decision for you and your family, right? So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if they sell or not. You're going to get an opportunity to send out an appointment, and then also someone will get an opportunity to have an at-bat, and you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So it took 7 phone calls. That's a pretty big deal. So anyone can join us. You just open up that laptop. And so I encourage you to check out that Facebook page, our community, facebook.com, Educate, Empower, Explore, California. And you could watch, it's a 2-hour video of Zach and Amy teaching. And they're going to do that every day, Monday through Friday. All right, and then so we're going to go ahead and jump in to day 12 of real estate school, CC&Rs, chapter 38, common boundary structures, chapter 39, encroachments, crossing the line, chapter 40, easements, personal rights, chapter 41, creating an easement, chapter 42, termination of easements. We are reading 261 to page 287. Is 261 to 287, is that right? Wow, have we ever only read 26 pages on this before? That's wonderful. Well, let's go ahead and let's see if we can knock that out. So this video might end up being a little bit shorter than these other videos because we were having a class discussion before we got started about scripts, about knocking on doors. Everybody had a lot of thoughts about the class that we had yesterday and some of the door knocking scripts. And so we just, we brainstormed a little bit about all the different things that you could do if you're prospecting for real estate by offering value. Oh, would you mind? Thank you very much. Okay, here we go. We're jumping in. We only got 26 pages. I think we may end up having a quick day. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Man, I cannot get over. Is it really only 26 pages? It is indeed. Okay, cool. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions. We're going to get into it. Recording restrictive covenants. Developers subdivide land into 2 or more horizontal or vertical sections called lots, parcels, or units. Having created a subdivision, developers place restrictive covenants on how the lots may be used by later owners called successors. Use restrictions are usually contained in a document called a Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, CC&Rs. CC&Rs are typically recorded with the original subdivision map. Recorded documents in the chain of title to a parcel of real estate place a buyer on constructive notice of their contents. A prospective buyer of a home in a subdivision protects themselves from unknowingly buying property burdened with unwanted restrictions by reviewing a preliminary title report or a prelim prior to acquiring the property. A prelim discloses the results of the title company's search of the property's title history. The prelim functions with very limited purpose of the title company's revocable offer to issue a title policy. As a customer service, title companies supply copies of any CC&Rs of record to buyers or their agents on request. Covenants specifying use are affirmative. A recorded restriction can limit the use of a property to a specific purpose, e.g. a school, railroad, highway, dwelling, or irrigation system. This type of restriction is classified as an affirmative covenant. Another type of recorded restriction prohibits identified uses of the property. Prohibitive restrictives are classified as a negative covenant. For example, a typical negative covenant prohibits the sale of alcoholic beverages or other activities otherwise allowed to take place on the property. CC&Rs and future owners. Recorded CC&Rs bind future owners of the subdivided lots, a scheme referred to as covenants running with the land. For a covenant to run with the land and affect title and future owners, the restriction needs to directly benefit the property. Thus, to benefit one lot, all lots within the subdivision need to be burdened by the restriction. Consider a restriction limiting the use of all subdivision lots to single-family residences. The use restriction equally benefits and burdens each lot in the subdivision, assuring consistent and compatible use through the subdivision. A benefit with an advantageous effect on each property. Since it benefits every lot, the restriction runs with the title to each lot and affects all future owners. So for example, right now there's somebody that is looking for a piece of property where they could build multiple properties. And so I'm looking at a lot of these mobiles that are teardowns where they can pull the mobile away, set up a new mobile, but what they want is they want multiple residences on the property. They want to be able to either subdivide the lot or have the zoning already be there. Well, some of these properties are zoned Ag 10, so there's an agriculture component. Some of them are zoned R4 or R5 or RA5. And so there's a lot of different zoning types. And if you get kind of confused or held up when you see one of these, just feel free to type it into Google. And what will happen is the city of Temecula or the city of Murrieta, their zoning will pop up. And then you'll be able to read specifically what these different types of zoning are and what the restrictions are. Like, for example, if you're looking to buy a house, and you're like, oh, well, there's 5 acres. I want to go ahead and build 2 more houses on that. Well, if it's zoned R1, that means you can only build 1 house on that lot. Whereas if it's zoned RR, that means you could build 1 house and another house of equal or lesser size on it, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of CC&Rs. There are a lot of restrictions, especially in the city of Temecula, where like in the groves, or I think it's called, a certain percentage of the lot has to be orange groves or avocado trees or planted vineyards. And so there's a lot of different restrictions, and you just need to make sure that if your client is buying a lot of land or a little bit of land, sometimes they may not be able to do all the things that they think that they're going to be able to do on it. Okay, sorry to get off into the woods, but I wanted to make sure that everybody understood what we were talking about. Consider a restriction limiting the use of, okay, however, consider a subdivider who sells a beachfront lot while retaining ownership of the surrounding lots in the subdivision. The grant deed conveying the beachfront lot to the buyer contains a use restriction stating the buyer can only operate a hotel or yachting clubhouse on the yacht. The buyer, unable to develop the property for the purposes set out in the use restrictions, sells the lot to a developer who plans to use the property for a ferry landing service. The subdivider seeks to prohibit the developer from conducting a business which violates the restrictive use covenant and the recorded grant deed to the original buyer. Can the subdivider enforce the covenant entered into by the original buyer and stop the developer from using the lot for a ferry service? No. The use restriction provides no benefit to the beachfront lot since it merely imposes a burden on the original buyer who agreed to limit their use of the property. Enforcement of the restriction is further limited due to its lack of wording binding the buyer's successors in interest to the restrictive covenant. The restriction is only enforceable as long as the original buyer holds title. Bye. Have a good night. Thus, it is classified as a personal covenant. Since the restriction against use is a personal promise, it does not run with the land and cannot be imposed on the developer who reacquired title. Unenforceable or unreasonable CC&Rs. Restrictions on selling, leasing, or encumbrances real estate may not unreasonably restrict the marketability of the property, even if the restriction is contained in a trust deed or lease agreement. However, due-on-sell clauses contained in a trust deed are no longer controlled by California law and under federal mortgage law are enforceable on the transfer of any interest in the real estate except short-term leases up to 3 years not coupled with a purchase option and intrafamily transfers of 1 to 4 unit owner-occupied residential property on the death of an owner or for equity financing. CC&Rs on the installation or use of a solar energy system are unenforceable if the restrictions significantly increase the cost of the system or decrease its efficiency by resulting in more than a 20% increase in the installation cost or system or decreasing the operating efficiency of the solar system by more than 20%. Chapter 37 in the books. Chapter 38, Common Boundary Structures. Shared rights and responsibilities. Most properties have 3 property lines setting the common boundary with the adjacent properties owned by others. A 4th property line usually sets the frontage of a public right-of-way such as a street. The location of the property lines might be represented by an improvement which acts as a demarcation of the property line called a common boundary improvement. A common boundary improvement may be a party wall, boundary fence, tree line, driveway, or ditch. Prospective buyers interested in a property are concerned about the ownership of any common boundary improvements and who is responsible for their maintenance. The rights of the adjacent property owners when setting up, maintaining, or removing common boundary improvements depend on the type of improvement which exists. Party walls are owned by both. Common boundary improvements other than trees located on the property line between adjacent properties are called property walls. A party wall may be in the form of a wall, fence, or building wall co-owned by the adjacent property owners. The use and ownership of a party wall is best set forth in a written agreement between adjacent property owners. The agreement defines each owner's responsibility for sharing the cost of the maintenance of the party wall. However, these written agreements rarely exist. An adjoining property owner cannot remove or destroy a party wall without the consent of the other owner, since each has an interest in the party wall. An owner can alter a party wall, such as installing cosmetic ornamentation on their side, as well as they do not injure the wall or interfere with the adjoining property owner's use of the party wall. So this ends up being sort of an issue if you don't understand what is legal and what is not legal. Sometimes people will say, oh, well, the fence is in disrepair, so VA is not going to cover it. Well, VA does not cover shared common grounds. And so as long as it is not a health and safety condition, like the fence is falling over and it might fall down and hurt somebody, they're not going to worry about it when it comes to the funding of the loan. And so you can't say, oh, I'm sure that the neighbor will go in on it with you after you buy it. That's rarely the case because, fencing is expensive And when it comes time to share that sort of an expense, not everybody's got a couple $1,000s laying around. And not everybody wants to have one wall improved and not have the other wall done. So in order to get a whole bunch of people around you to agree to replace fencing ends up being sometimes a larger headache than a lot of people realize, and they end up incurring the entire expense themselves. So just understand that that shared party wall, uh, just like it says, the writing and agreements rarely exist to enforce that the common interest, and that is enforceable financially for both parties, and when that should be enforced. Okay, moving on. Boundary fences and cost contributions. For security and privacy purposes, many properties are fenced in by a boundary fence. A boundary fence may be a party wall co-owned by adjacent property owners. If an owner who leaves their land unfenced later decides to enclose it by using the existing fence as part of the enclosure, they need to compensate the neighbor who built the fence for the pro rata value of the neighbor's fence used by the owner. Maintaining the good neighbor fence. Owners of adjoining properties are presumed to benefit equally from the boundary fences. Under this presumption, all adjoining owners are equally responsible for constructing, maintaining, and replacing boundary fences. The responsibility for constructing, maintaining, or replacing boundary fences may be altered or removed only by a written agreement by all affected owners or an adjoining owner's judicial petition to remove or alter their responsibility. Trees are solely owned, government owned, or commonly owned. A tree's ownership is determined by the location of its trunk. Solely owned trees belong to the owner of the property on which the trunk is growing. Trees growing on government-owned parcels, such as a right-of-way streets and sidewalks, belong to the local government. However, shrubbery or trees whose trunks stand partly on the land of two adjacent property owners belong to the adjacent property owners as tenants in common. These trees are called line trees or common boundary trees. Adjacent owners who own line trees as tenants in common are jointly responsible for maintaining the trees. Sharing boundary trees. Co-owners of boundary trees as adjoining property owners both enjoy the use of the trees. The use allowed a co-owner of a boundary trees is the same as the use allowed to the owner of solely owned trees, as long as the use does not interfere with the other owner's use and enjoyment of the trees. Remedies. To avoid disputes, adjacent property owners enter into an agreement detailing how they will handle the maintenance of boundary trees. If a boundary tree injures the health and safety of a property owner or prevents them from enjoying their property, the tree may constitute a nuisance and can be removed. A co-owner of a boundary tree might refuse to consent to the removal of a boundary tree. If the tree constitutes a nuisance, an abatement of the nuisance is allowed. For example, boundary trees may be a nuisance if their branches or the trees themselves continually fall, threatening the safety of people using the adjacent property or damaging improvements on the adjacent property. You would be surprised how little any of this comes up, quite honestly. But it's good to know, I suppose. Encroachments. Crossing the line. Chapter 39. 269. We're flying right along. Boundaries violated and hardships balanced. Consider an owner of an unimproved parcel of real estate. Shortly after their purchase, the owner discovers the garage on their neighbor's property extends 2 feet over the boundary line into the owner's property, called an encroachment. The owner demands the neighbor remove the encroachment. The neighbor claims the improvement does not need to be removed since the encroachment was unknown and unintentional. The square footage of the owner's property affected by the encroachment is minor, and the cost to remove the garage would far exceed the monetary loss to the owner if the encroachment were allowed to continue. Can the owner obtain a court order forcing the removal of the encroaching garage? No. The encroachment is unintentional and minor in its effect on the burdened owner. Thus, the burden to the owner does not justify ordering the neighbor to undertake an expensive reconstruction activity. Instead, the owner is awarded money losses based on the rental value for the loss of the use of their property. Further, the neighbor is granted an easement over the owner's property for the life of the garage. For the neighbor to be allowed to maintain the encroachment, the neighbor is required to have acted in good faith when building the improvements. This means the neighbor needs to have constructed the improvements without knowledge they encroached on the owner's property. If the neighbor had not constructed the improvements in good faith, the owner is entitled to a court order called an injunction forcing the removal of the encroaching structure no matter how minor the encroachment. Statute of limitations. Also, for the owner to recover money losses for the encroachment, they have to have acted within a 3-year period of the statute of limitations. If the owner delays too long in making their claim, the encroaching neighbor earns the right to maintain the encroachment without paying rent or lost value. Even if a new owner, if a property burdened by the encroachment seeks an injunction of money losses from the neighbor immediately after acquiring the property, their action can be barred by a 3-year statute of limitations. Today I was like, I need to drink water. It's just been Frappuccinos and Coke. So I pop this thing open right here. Okay. Here we go. The limitations period does not run from the discovery of the encroachment or the acquisition of the property. Instead, it begins to run from the creation date of the encroachment. Although the owner may not recover money losses from the neighbor, they may recover losses from the seller due to the seller's failure to disclose the existence of the known encroachment. The loss is based on the diminished value of the property and the excess purchase price paid. That was not intentional for me to close that out. My phone is doing that thing again. Okay, an encroachment is an improvement on the real estate which extends onto real estate belonging to another person without their consent. Thus, encroachment frequently takes the form of a building, fence, driveway, or tree. The concept of an encroachment is closely related to a trespass, nuisance, and boundary dispute. All involve an interference with another person's property rights. An encroachment qualifies as a nuisance. Nuisance is broadly defined as any obstruction of another's use and enjoyment of their real estate. See Chapter 45. An encroachment also constitutes a trespass when it actually rests on the ground of the neighbor's property. However, the names used to describe interferences are unimportant. One way or another, an owner is entitled to recover for unauthorized interferences for their property rights. Once an encroachment has been determined, the remedies available to the owner include an injunction ordering the removal of the encroaching structure or money losses for the diminishing value of the property. Drawing the line. All that is needed to establish the existence of an encroachment is a survey locating the property line. If an improvement on one parcel extends over the line onto an adjacent parcel, it is an encroachment. Occasionally, neighboring owners disputing the existence of an encroachment rely on contradictory surveys to establish the property line. If the owners cannot agree on the location of the property line, the boundary dispute is to be resolved before any remedy of the encroachment can be granted. Boundary disputes are most frequently resolved by a court. The court determines which of these surveys is more accurate, balancing the hardships. An owner is entitled to terminate or prevent an unauthorized intrusion into their real estate. However, when a building or other substantial improvement encroaches on an owner's property, the neighbor's cost of removing the encroachment may far exceed the damage inflicted on the owner's burden by the encroachment. Thus, the encroachment is allowed to continue and the owner is awarded money losses. I forgot to put this thing on airplane mode. I'm sorry. Now I'm like, I don't want to keep playing Russian roulette here. Okay. The condition of balancing hardships, merely granting money losses and allowing an encroachment to continue, are the owner of the property affected by the encroachment may not suffer an irreparable injury due to the continued existence of the encroachment. The neighbor who owns the encroaching structure needs to have acted innocently and in good faith, and the cost of the neighbor of removing the encroachment needs to greatly exceed the damage done to the owner. The good faith of a neighbor who constructs improvements which encroach on the land of another's needs to exist before any balancing of the hardship can take place. Thus, the good faith requirement prevents an intentional exploitation of the balancing hardships rule. The encroachment easement. When the continuance of an encroachment on an owner's property is allowed, the encroaching neighbor is granted an equitable easement to maintain the improvement of the owner's property. Further, the neighbor needs to compensate the owner for the rental value of the lost use of their property. The easement lasts for the lifetime of the encroachment. Encroachments never die. Limitations and delay. An owner seeking to terminate an encroachment or recover money losses is subject to a 3-year statute of limitations running from the commencement of the encroachment. The limitation period for the encroachment is the same as a permanent nuisance, since the damage to the owner is complete and certain as soon as the encroachment is created. The limitation period runs for the creation of the encroachment, not its discovery. Whether or not an owner has knowledge an encroachment exists does not affect the statute of limitations. However, where damage resulting from an encroachment is progressive over time, the 3-year statute of limitations does not apply from the date of creation. For instance, an owner's building is damaged when a neighbor's building leans on it due to a poorly compacted fill. The degree of the tilt and the resulting damage increases over time. More than 3 years after the damage commences, the owner seeks to recover money losses from the neighbor. The neighbor claims the owner barred from recovering money losses due to a running of the 3-year limitations period. However, the intrusion on an owner's building is continuous and progressive. A further intrusion. As with continuing nuisance, a new claim accrues each time the loss increases. Thus, while the 3-year statute of limitations does apply, it does not begin to run on the commencement of the encroachment, but runs for the date of the last increase in damage from the progressively increasing encroachment. In addition to barring relief due to the statute of limitations, an action seeking money losses or an injunction against encroachment can be barred by the equitable doctrine of laches, also known as prejudicial delay or detrimental reliance. A property owner loses their right to enforce the removal of an encroachment or recover money against the encroaching neighbor if the owner delays in making the claim, causing the owner to rely on the owner's acquiescence to their detriment. We've only got 12 more pages, holy smokes. Easements, running or personal. Rights in another's property. An easement is the right of one property owner to use the property of another. The most common easement is used for ingress and egress. An easement for ingress and egress creates a right-of-way allowing one property owner to traverse a portion of another's land to access their property. Holy smokes. So like if you need to access your property from the main road and you have to drive through another property, a lot of times there will be like a dirt road or there will be a paved road or something like that that is an easement that cuts through another person's property to your property. So the VA has to make sure that there's an actual easement that's granted and allowed, and so that you can access the property from the main road. But anyway, that's ingress and egress. Ingress to the property, egress out of the property. An easement creates a tenement relationship between two parcels of real estate since it benefits one property, referred to as the dominant tenement, whose owner is entitled to the use of the easement, and burdens another property referred to as the servient tenement, the owner uses of which is subject to the easement. So the person who they're driving through their property, that's the one that is burdened. The servient and the dominant is the one who's driving through. When an owner whose property is burdened by an easement interferes with the use of the easement by a neighbor whose property benefits them from the easement, the neighbor is entitled to have the use of the easement reinstated. The easement is reinstated by either removal, relocation, or modification of the interference. Further, the neighbor who holds the easement is entitled to compensation for money losses caused by the servient tenement's owner obstruction of the neighbor's use of the easement. Appurtenant or in the gross does the easement run. An easement burdening an owner's property as an encumbrance on their title is classified as either an appurtenant easement, meaning the allowed use belongs to the benefits of an adjacent property and is said to run with the land as an interest the adjacent property holds in the burdened real estate, or An easement in gross, meaning it belongs to an individual, not land, as their personal right to a specified use of the burden real estate. And an impertinent easement is an incidental to the title of the property which benefits from its use. An easement is not reflected as a recorded interest on the title to the parcel of land it benefits, nor is it a personal right held by a particular individual who may now or have previously owned the parcel benefiting the easement. Accordingly, an appurtenant easement is recorded as an encumbrance on the title to the burdened property. The easement remains on the property title after a conveyance to new owners of either the benefiting or burdened property. To be enforceable, the easement does not need to be referenced in the grant deed conveying either the property to new owners, since it runs with the land. Conversely, an easement in gross benefits a particular person, not the real estate owned by that person. An easement in gross is personally held by the individual who may use the easement. No parcel of real estate may benefit from an easement in gross, since only the individual holding the easement can benefit. An easement in gross is a personal right that is not transferred with the sale of real estate owned by the holder of the easement. However, the right can be transferred by the easement holder to another person by writing, unless the transfer of the easement in gross is prohibited by a provision, the document creating the easement. Easements for light, air, or view. A property owner has no automatic right and cannot acquire a prescriptive right to air, light, or unaltered view over a neighbor's property. However, a property owner can hold an easement created by a grant which restricts a neighbor's ability to erect or maintain any improvement which interferes with the owner's right to air, light, or view. The easement might be the result of conditions, covenants, and restrictions which blanket several properties with use restrictions, such as restrictions on height. Easements for light and air and view can only be established by written agreement between neighboring owners, not by implications of prescription. For example, you buy an oceanfront property where you can see the ocean from a little ways off. Somebody builds a second story to their house in between you and the ocean. You can no longer see the ocean. Do you own the right to the view? No, not necessarily. So, for example, another example, and more close to home, in French Valley, in French Valley 1, French Valley 2, a lot of these people were told that there were never going to be two-story homes built in French Valley. And then what happened is the people who came along who developed our homes, where I live, built a bunch of two-story homes, which cut off the views of the mountains for all of these single-story homes, and frustrated a lot of people. And so, but what happened was that was never something that was put in writing by the builder, or of course, all the people in the cells, floors that were saying things like this or whatnot, allegedly. So what happened was all these people moved in, and they tried to prevent these two-story buildings from being built, but they didn't really have a leg to stand on. So anyway, just kind of an interesting thing to think about. There are people that, like, a school will be built and then a commercial lease. Somebody will want to build a high-rise. And they'll say, oh, well, it casts a shadow on a certain time of day onto the school's property. And they'll try to sue to prevent the commercial building from being built. And so, anyway, that's kind of the way that works as far as light, air, or view. A relatively recent type of an easement is the solar easement. Solar easements were established with the intent of encouraging the productive use of solar energy systems as a matter of public policy. A solar easement granted in a written instrument needs to state the measured angles by which sunlight is to pass, the hours of day by which the easement is effective, the limitations on any object which would impair the passage of sunlight through the easement, and the terms for terminating or revisiting the easement. Solar easements are similar to easements of light, air, or view, since they restrict an owner's ability to maintain any improvements interfering with a neighbor's solar energy system. Conservation easements. A conservation easement is a voluntary conveyance of the right to keep the land in its natural scenic, historical, agricultural, forested, or open space condition. It is conveyed by an owner of real estate to a conservation organization or government agency. A conservation easement can be created in the form of an easement or CC&R by use of a deed, will or other instrument to convey the easement. Conservation easements are perpetual in duration and thus are binding on all successive owners of the property burdened by the conservation easement. Oh my goodness, look at us flying right along. Chapter 41, Creating an Easement. By grant, reservation, or implication. The basic method for creating an easement is by writing. Any document which may be used to convey a legal interest in real estate may be used to create an easement. An easement can be created between the benefiting and burdened properties in an easement agreement, will, grant deed, easement deed, quitclaim deed, lease, order of the court, or covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And of course, we actually got to a very late start today because we were brainstorming in the class for about 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and keep reading here and finish the reading for today because it was so short. While the documents creating an easement does not have to be recorded, an unrecorded easement is no longer enforceable when the owner of the burdened property sells it to a buyer who is not charged with the knowledge of the easement, called a bona fide purchaser. An easement is created in the conveyance either by grant or reservation. For example, the owner of an adjacent property of real estate may sell one parcel to a buyer and further grant the buyer an easement over the parcel retained by the owner. Alternatively, an owner of an adjacent parcel may sell a parcel and in the grant deed conveying the parcel to the buyer, reserve to themselves an easement on the parcel conveyed for the benefit on the parcel the owner retained. Conduct creates an implied easement. An easement can be created by conduct without any prior agreement between the owner and the user, called implied easement. Implied easement exists when circumstances surrounding an owner's division of their property and sale of a portion of the property imply the owner, grantor, and the buyer, grantee, intended either the grant of an easement on the portion retained by the owner or the reservation of an easement by the owner on the portion sold. For an implied easement to exist, the easement needs to reasonably necessary for the beneficial use of the parcel whose owner is seeking established easement. Easement or fee, title conveyed by deed. The term reservation and exception in conveyances of real estate are used to distinguish whether the legally described reservation, easement, or the exception, ownership, is created as a burden on the property conveyed for the beneficial use of another property, such as an easement by reservation, or retained by the parcel conveyed as a property of the seller, an exception for land which is not transferred on the conveyance of a portion on the larger parcel. Implied is appurtenant. Regardless of how an applied easement is created, it is always a burden on one parcel of land and for the benefit of another parcel. Thus, an implied easement is always an appurtenance allowing the owner of the property benefiting from the easement to use the property of another which is burdened by the easement. Most disputes over implied easements occur after the property burdened by the easement has been deeded out to one or new owners. To be entitled to an implied easement, the owner claiming the implied easement is to establish their right of use in another property existed when one of the parcels was conveyed to a buyer by the common owner of both parcels. Easements by necessity. An easement by necessity is a variation of an implied easement. The demand for an easement by necessity when property is landlocked. Access to and from public roadway across all adjacent properties is denied in a landlocked property for the lack of an ability to create an easement by an agreement or prior conduct. Since public policy favors the productive use of land, an easement by necessity will be created by when property is landlocked. Excuse me, goodness. However, to establish an easement by necessity, the user needs to show strict necessity and defend against any claim that the property was intended to be landlocked. Strict necessity requires the easement to be the only possible means of access. Prescription easement by adverse use. Consider a property owner who has used the roadway on an adjoining property to access their vacation home for over 5 years. The owner has never received permission from the neighbor to use the roadway. The neighbor sells their property to a buyer who informs the owner they can no longer use the roadway. The owner claims their open and continuous use of the road to access their property for more than 5 years entitles them to a right-of-way easement over the adjoining property. Is the owner entitled to a roadway easement over the adjoining property owned by the buyer? Yes, a prospective easement is established for the adverse use of another's property for the period in excess of 5 years. An easement created by prescription is similar to acquiring land by adverse possession. The difference in prescription establishes the right to mere use of another's property, whereas adverse possession is an actual taking of an exclusive possession under a claim of ownership and the payment of property taxes. To meet the legal requirements for acquiring an easement by prescription, the adverse use needs to be obvious enough to give the owner of the property notice of the use, a continuous and uninterrupted pattern of use, a use unauthorized by the owner property, used under a claim of right, and used for a period of 5 or more years without the owner acting to terminate the adverse use. The 5-year requirement of uninterrupted use continues on the transfer of the benefiting property to the owner as long as the new owner continues the same unauthorized use of the burden adjoining property established by the previous owner called tacking. Okay, we've got 4 more pages. Termination of easements. Let's knock it out. Extinguishing an easement. An existing easement can be extinguished. Once extinguished, the easement no longer affects the burdened property as encumbrances on its title. Methods used to extinguish an easement include release of the easement by a deed from the owner of the property holding the appurtenant right to the easement, merger by the acquisition of a fee title to both the benefiting burdened properties by the same owner, destruction of the burdened property, which permanently prevents any further use of the easement, forfeiture due to the easement's holder's abuse of their easement's rights, prescription due to the burdened property's owner's continuing interference with the easement, and abandonment by the conduct of the easement holder showing they do not intend to use their easement rights. Release by deed to burdened property. An owner of the property from the use of an easement may voluntarily terminate it by releasing the easement to the owner of the burdened property. The release can be accomplished by the use of a quitclaim deed or grant deed in favor of the owner of the burdened property, signed by the owner of the property holding the appurtenant right to use the easement. Merger as an extinguisher. A merger of legal interests comprising the servient and dominant tenement rights and obligations in 2 properties due to common ownership of both properties extinguishes an easement. A merger occurs when the same owner acquires fee title to both benefiting and burdened properties. An owner cannot have an easement over their own property benefiting for the benefit of their own property. Thus, the easement is automatically extinguished on the common ownership of both the properties. However, no merger occurs when the owner of the burdened property acquires a fractional interest in the title to the benefiting property as a co-owner, since the owner is not the sole owner of both properties. Additionally, acquiring a lien, such as a trust deed encumbering either the benefiting of burdened property by the owner of the other property, is not a merger of interest. Extinguished by destruction of property. An easement is terminated by the destruction of the burdened property. Non-existence of the burdened property renders the use of the easement impossible. Consider an easement to use a stairway in an adjoining building. When the building burns down, the easement is extinguished since the owner is not required to rebuild the stairway. Forfeiture for exceeding authority. An easement is terminated by forfeiture when the easement holder exceeds their authorized use of the easement by placing it an excessive burden on the property encumbered by the easement. For example, consider a subdivider who owns the land entitling them to use a right-of-way easement over a neighbor's property for access. Later, the subdivider divides the property into several residential lots For access, the subdivider constructs a road on the neighbor's property within the legally described easement to a public road. Here, the increased use of the easement constitutes an excessive burden on the property it encumbers, and thus the easement is extinguished by forfeiture. Prescription creates and destroys. An easement can be established by the adverse use of another's property. Likewise, an easement can be extinguished by the burdened property's owner's use of an area within the easement which permanently interferes within their neighbor's ability to use the easement. An adverse use which terminates an easement is any act by the burdened property owner which permanently obstructs the beneficial use enjoyed by the holder of the easement. Consider a subdivider who sells an unimproved parcel of land, granting the buyer a right-of-way easement for ingress and egress over the adjoining parcel. Later, the subdivider constructs a concrete block wall on the common boundary line, which blocks any use of the easement by the buyer. More than 5 years after the block wall was constructed, the buyer of the parcel benefiting from the easement seeks to quiet title to the right-of-way. Here, the obstruction of the easement is an adverse use by the subdivider of the property burdened by the easement. Thus, the easement is extinguished since the subdivider totally interfered with the use of the easement for a period of 5 years. Abandonment, never to use again. An easement can also be terminated through abandonment by the easement holder. The termination of an easement by abandonment is not easily established. The easement holder's actions need to demonstrate a clear intent to permanently abandon all future use of the easement and never to use it again. Blam! We got our reading done today. Bah! High five at home. We flippin' did it. Just in case you weren't prepared, we'll do another one. Bah! Okay, fantastic. That is done. That's in the books. That's lights out. So if you guys ever have any questions, feel free to let us know. We do this Monday through Friday, every day at 4 o'clock. You can feel free to reach out to us, and I will set you up with the Zoom link so that you can be a part of this class. Happy to do that. Just feel free to reach out to me. I'll get you the Zoom link. The class is posted to YouTube every single day, and the adult class is posted to Facebook and streamed live. And also, if you know anyone who's Spanish speaking who wants to get their license, we do have our adult class translated live in Spanish. So I appreciate you watching. I'm going to check the Zoom chat right now to see if there are any questions. Oh, Janice Lovendahl tuned in. Janice, my friend. Appreciate you tuning in. Let me check the chat here really quick. Okay. All right, Fred. How could someone go about finding those folks moving to California from other states before they get here? I'm guessing social media could be a great way. From other states. How could someone go about finding those folks moving to California from other states? Yeah, social media definitely could be a good way. There's another great way, which is, so anything that you're doing in real estate, any way that you're working, you're creating a net. And the more that you create this web, this net, the more flies you're going to catch in it, right? And so if you create a web series or a YouTube series or a blog, hey, are you thinking about relocating to California? And then you buy a domain name, relocate-to-california.com, right? Or, moving to California.com. You could create a whole business platform around that. There's so many good ideas out there. And of course, you and your son have a lot of them. And so it can get easy to get overwhelmed by all the different ones. So, but that's definitely a great one. So let's say you buy relocate-to-california.com or moving-to-california.com, and you do a YouTube series pointing people back to the website, and then a series of landing pages that you're now sharing out and promoting to Facebook, doing sponsored ads. Are you thinking about relocating to California? And then also another thing that you could do is you could start Facebook groups, or you could put up things on Instagram, hashtagging, this different sort of stuff. You can, create a Facebook page, about, this different kind of stuff, and then with different type of, or like write a blog. The top 10 pieces of advice for people moving to Southern California. And so the more different things that you create out there that are all pointing back to you, it's a giant web, right? And so that would be a good way to do that is by utilizing social media, understanding, looking into SEO to increase the amount of traffic that you're going to get, getting your business, up and running. Anyway, there's a million and five more different things, but we started with that discussion before class, which was a great discussion. And but I'm flipping hungry, and I need to get home. So if you have any other questions, feel free to ruminate on them a little bit. I don't see any other questions in the chat right now.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you again. And hi, Janice.
You got it, my friend. Hi, Janice.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, I'm going to go ahead and kill the feed at this point, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel.
See you tomorrow.
Bye, Fred. Bye, James. Bye,
Thank
Janice. And thank you so much for watching. Feel free to hit subscribe. Feel free to like our page, follow us on Facebook, or check out educatedpowerexplorer.com. And then I do something that not a lot of people do, which is I do pass out my personal cell phone number, which I will put up on the page here right now if I could find it for you. And then that way you can reach out to me directly. Just understand that I don't pick up my phone if I don't recognize the number. So what we'll do is we'll get it on the schedule. You can reach out to me. We'll get it figured out. All right. Thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your night. And proud of you. You got through a lot of boring stuff today.